certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Kira Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
Despite examining thousands of women, the doctor who treated a 17-year-old girl brutally raped by Bradley Edwards 25 years ago today told why this assault was one that had stuck in her mind. Welcome to Claremont in Conversation as the trial enters week 6. I'm Natalie Bonjolo with criminal defence lawyer Damien Cripps and legal affairs editor Tim Clark. Before we talk about the evidence presented today, we would just like to warn listeners that some of what was discussed is distressing. Tim, can you tell us about the doctor who treated the Karrakatta rape victim?
Yes, Nat. Hi, this is Dr Amanda Barnard. She worked for something called the SARC, which is the Sexual Assault Resources Centre, based here in Perth. They were a service that was offered to, and still is offered to, sex assault victims in Perth that gave them, obviously, some counselling, but also they had medical practitioners on staff that examined victims for several purposes, obviously to check them over medically, but also to take forensic samples from sex assault victims in a consistent and sterile manner for use going forward in any possible criminal prosecution. And this was the case in 1995 when this young girl, who was just 17 at the time, reported the assault in Karrakatta Cemetery.
And why did this assault stick out in Dr Barnard's mind?
Well, as you mentioned in the intro, Dr Barnard was also a medical doctor. So this wasn't just her only role. So she said she'd intimately examined thousands of women over her long career, but this did still stick in her mind so long after for various reasons. She said the violence attached to the attack. We know that the young lady was attacked from behind. She was hooded, she was gagged, she was tied up, she was placed in a van. She said the youth of the victim, she was only 17. The wounds that she saw stuck in her mind, particularly because of the restraints that were used on ankles and wrists. She said she remembered that definitely. She thought at the time that this young girl had been restrained in the manner that she described, and also the fact that this was this young girl's, horribly, tragically, this was her first sexual experience. She was a virgin before this happened on this night. So for all those factors, she said that this was an attack that particularly stuck out in her mind then and still does today.
And I guess sometimes, I don't know, Damien, if you've got much experience with these kinds of cases, but would it be more often the case that the victim would be known to the perpetrator, perhaps?
Well, it's difficult to say, Nat, and I feel like I'm always answering my questions in that manner. But I would have thought in a case like the one that Dr Barnard was giving evidence about, there was a couple of points that Tim just raised then that wouldn't have been known to the perpetrator, whoever it was. And I know that Mr Edwards has pled guilty to it and has accepted the responsibility. But the fact that, well, I would have thought, I don't know for certain, but I would have thought the fact that she hadn't had any sexual involvement previously wouldn't have been something that he might have or might not have known. And this goes back to a lot of people interested in the concept of why he had pled guilty to this charge. And when we see this kind of thing coming up, Tim and Natalie, this is particularly why that question keeps coming up, because he paved the way for this material to come in, potentially, and this very detailed picture of a very violent incident that took place previously now becomes part of something that he's accepted responsibility for. I don't think that it's something that in the case that's ongoing, given all of our prior discussions about the significant mind of the person who's at the helm of the ship, if I could put it that way, that this kind of material will have the same impact it would have on listeners or people in the public gallery at the trial, because I think the justice in this case would have heard thousands of cases that would be similar and had similar content that does. So he would be very well set up to put that into the right place in his mind when making a decision about what's going on with the cases before him. And if the case was that, because I don't know the specific case, if the case was that Mr. Edwards knew this person, the subject of this attack, there would have been elements that he didn't know about her. I would have thought.
Why, I guess, could these details be important to the case, given that, as you've just said, Bradley Edwards has pleaded guilty to this? So, why is this being discussed in such great detail, apart from, I guess, the DNA and the forensic side of things?
Well, the interesting thing there is, and this would be an interesting thing for the listeners to do in their own mind, when you hear those words that were, or you hear the definitions that were put forward by Dr Barnard today, that Tim's been kind enough to recount for us, what does that make the listener think? So when the listener listens to that, consider themselves as a jury, they hear what was put before the court, and what does that do to their opinion of his guilt or otherwise? And my initial thought would be that one of the really, really poignant things that comes out of that is that it's a violent assault on a stranger that involves some fairly significant hooded, restrained. They're not just normal, I've lost control and I'm angry, or they're sort of somewhat calculated, I would have thought. And if you put that into a forum where people can consider that against what's being alleged, it's almost a waterfall effect of like, oh my goodness, this is... But that's what I'm saying about the great thing about having a mind like we do at the helm of the ship in Justice Hall. He's got the capacity, I believe, that's just my opinion, he's got the capacity to be able to put that in the right place rather than letting a waterfall cascade effect happen, because those words, and Tim, you were there, but I would have thought those words are emotional. They pull on parents and family members. When you hear those kind of words and you think about someone you love having something like that done to them, it pulls pretty hard on the heartstrings.
Yeah, absolutely, Amy. You would know. I've said it many times before during this trial already. It's never easy to hear that stuff, but it is legally necessary. And to go to Nat's question, there will be the question of propensity as well, which will be raised later on in the trial and has already been raised by the prosecution. And they will say, well, look at this attack, which this Mr. Edwards has now pleaded guilty to, and then look at what we're alleging, and then you look at all the possible, parallel lines between a young girl coming home from the Claremont night entertainment district at night, had a drink, vulnerable, alone, and then she's taken for a sexual purpose, from the street and attacked. And they will say, well, look at the similarities, and there are many. So there's that, and then, as you say, Nat, most significant, or maybe equal significance, is the DNA taken from the victim at the time that Dr Barnard recounted today. She took those swabs, she put them in the pots, she put them in the sterilised bags, and she gave them to a police officer to go and put them into exhibits. And they will become important because they match. So the prosecution say that those DNA exhibits taken from that victim match the DNA on Kira from the prosecution side, but the defence say those exhibits, both of them were in the same lab at the same time, which is where the possibility of contamination comes from, which is at the very, very heart of the prosecution case and the defence case.
Absolutely, Tim. And so it was really effective how you drew us to the heart of the issue from the issue about the Karrakatta information. And what I thought would be quite useful for people playing this out in their mind is that, and sorry to use you as my test dummy, Tim, if I can,
All right.
But if I said to you, you heard the evidence of Dr Amanda Barnard today, and you took it on board and you accepted it all, so you took it on face value and you said she was a credible witness and you accepted it all, does that mean that is it direct evidence that Mr Edwards committed these 3 murders?
Well, no. I mean, you cannot take that. You cannot take that as direct evidence.
No. So people have to be. That's the starting point to start to unpack that. When it pulls on your emotional heartstrings and you're thinking about, he did that and that's terrible. It doesn't unequivocally put him as committing these other 3 murders. But the way that process will be unpacked by the judiciary has a whole bunch of rules, and the way that is in the way that can be attributed to whatever the justice determines that it can be attributed to. So it's important for people to remember that this is just one tiny little element in a whole bunch of information that this human has to put before themselves and make a decision about. But as you pointed out, Tim, and we discussed that the words that are used in these kind of things affect people. People, it's violent assault. It's hooded and restrained. They're emotional words.
How would the defence be dealing with this sort of information today? What would they be looking to do with it, if anything?
Well, obviously I'm not involved in that case and I'm not running it. But my first thought would be that there would have been a lot of forethought that went into this. And they, obviously, as we've discussed before, they would have had information about this evidence well in advance. So they would have had an opportunity to consider at length how they were going to deal with it in the context of what Tim was talking about, the propensity evidence. So what submissions Mr Jovic might make in relation to what legal submissions he might make to Justice Hall in relation to how Justice Hall might appropriately deal with that propensity evidence. I'm not specifically sure what those submissions might be. They'd be lengthy. I would have thought they would take up some time and there would have been a lot of thought and research gone into them. So I would have thought that would be the first thing that the defence would be looking to do, is to deal with, to try to argue to what extent it can be considered in the context of the whole case. And Tim, I'm not sure you were there today. I'm not sure that there's much beyond that you could do, because he's pled guilty to it.
Yeah.
And this is a person coming along and saying, well, this is what I recall about it. I'm not sure how you could certainly object to certain things that they were saying if you thought that they weren't relevant. But you were there, Tim. Perhaps you can help us. Yeah. Was there objections to anything that she was saying?
In terms of the emotional impact of what that evidence induced or adduced today, the defence questioning of Dr Barnard didn't go there at all, because you would have thought, well, it didn't need to, because he's pleaded guilty to that. So there's no argument that all those injuries were inflicted. Yes, they were. There were avatars placed on the courtroom screens of where those injuries were, and we don't need to argue about who inflicted them, because we know Mr Edwards did. But what their questioning did go to was her collection of samples, how they were labelled, how they were sealed, how they were handled, how they were documented, and how they were handed over. Because that is at the heart of where the defence want to go, which is continuity of evidence, possible forensic breakdowns in process, to try and build a picture of possible flaws which could have led to one of those samples, which we know is Mr Edwards, somehow coming into contact with a sample that was yet to be taken, because Miss Glennon's body was only discovered in 1997. So that's where all their questioning was focused on, because that's all they needed to focus on. Prosecution, on the other hand, they had several irons in the fire today. There will be a sentencing of Mr Edwards for the Karrakatta rape down the track at some point, and Justice Hall might will have to take into account the injuries that were caused and the emotional distress that was caused, which we've already heard from, because the Karrakatta victims' various statements have already been read out. There was that. There was the process of them trying to prove that those forensic processes were solid, and also there will be some propensity argument in the months to come. So that's where the questioning went today, and it didn't go for too long, but it was as thorough as it needed to be on both sides.
So did Dr Barnard explain what happened once she'd taken the samples? Did she put them in sealed bags, and where did they go to next?
Yes, exactly that. So she described how the process of actually taking those samples was done. Where they were put, they were basically placed in sealed plastic containers, which were then placed inside bags, which were labelled clearly and documented. And there was also some clothing taken as well that we've heard about last week that was also bagged up, and then it was given to a specialist sexual assault police officer who was the next witness to follow, a police officer called Teresa Curtis, who then took all those exhibits or all those samples and transferred them first to a locked exhibits room in police headquarters, because it was a Sunday when this occurred, and then the following day took them to the laboratory where they were to be kept and processed and dealt with down the track. So I've said in the paper tomorrow it was the very, very first steps on this DNA pathway that were going to be taken on by both sides in the next months to come, in how those exhibits were how they were created, where they came from originally, all the way through to where they were stored at Path West, and if there was any possible way that they could have possibly come into contact with the fingernail scrapings and detritus that was taken from Kira's body in 1997 and stored in the same lab.
And Tim, did Teresa Curtis shed any light on how those shorts that we previously talked about were missing in that system for 8 months?
Yeah, she did. There was some detailing of how this property tracking system worked and how people were supposed to log stuff in when they first arrived and logged it out when they took it. But again, she couldn't be absolutely certain because of length of time. Since that occurrence, the amount of exhibits she dealt with before and since, so she couldn't be precise, but she did shed some more light on the overall process that surrounded it.
Damien, I wonder how important that can be, when you do have these little gaps in the timeline where, a really crucial piece of evidence is sort of missing in action for several months, and people keep asking me, well, is that really critical? Does that buy into the whole, beyond reasonable doubt situation?
Absolutely. When Tim was talking through just then, one of the issues is the fibres and whether they were stored and what happened to them when they were stored. Is there any possibility that at some point Miss Glennon's, the scrapings from under Miss Glennon's fingernails had come into contact with them such that they could be cross-contaminated? I think the question's probably even more open-ended than that. Yeah. The question is probably could they have been exposed to anything which could have also been exposed to Kiara Glennon's fingernail scrapings? And I understand that's quite expansive, but that's the problem with it, is that we don't know what the definitive answer is. The question is, does it create a reasonable doubt? Well, if there's a space in time, that's an issue. I don't know whether it's a reasonable doubt. I'm not going to be the judge of that, but it's an issue.
Yeah, and the circuitous route that particularly the macro task force exhibits, and particularly the crucial ones, these fingernails, hair samples, the places they've been and the distance they've travelled. It's not just a case of them having come from Wellard or Eglinton, gone to Path West and then been dealt with in a beautifully sealed bubble. They've gone to New Zealand. They've gone to the UK. Some of the hair samples have gone to America. The pathway of all these samples, and we're talking about tiny, microscopic, what Damien will know better than me, trace DNA. So this is not a big splodge that you can see with your naked eye. This is tiny, tiny amounts of DNA that were under Kira's fingernail, which is already broken down to the quick. And it had to go to Britain because they were at the time the only ones that had the technology to be able to test these tiny, tiny pieces of DNA. You're talking about a single fibre on those shorts, one single blue fibre, and those shorts had been handled. They'd been handled by various people, and so all these, and then all the possible sources that could have placed this fibre on those shorts, and all the other fibres as well in the hair, people who touched them, come into contact with the body bags, all those type of things. And then all the time that surrounds it, more than 20 years. I mean, it's a vast undertaking to try and prove that everything was done properly at every step, but that's what the prosecution has to do.
One of the great quotes that I can take from Tim, and I will take it from him, I'll literally take it, and I'll run it somewhere, is that, and I've never heard it before, Tim, I think that I heard you say that it's worth repeating, that the threshold for the defence is quite low, in that they've just got to just show a reasonable doubt, somehow make the judiciary aware that there's a reasonable doubt. And then you said, Tim, I think you said that, but on the other hand, the prosecution have got a much higher threshold to get. They've got to prove beyond that reasonable doubt. And I agreed with that when you said that. I thought that was a really good explanation, because there is a significant, I think as well, gap between a reasonable doubt and beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, there is definitely a step you've got to take. You've got to literally go beyond it. And it's what prosecutors are paid to do, is to compile all this evidence as to such a standard that you're right, Damien. I probably went too far when I say I got to be absolutely certain, but the bar is very high. It's deliberately high, and it should be high, because in this case it definitely should be high, because there can be no graver accusation that's been made to Mr. Edwards by the prosecution, and they should be put to the highest standard to prove it.
Yeah, and Tim, one of the things that we might not have covered through the course of the podcast, which is worth raising as a reference point, is a lot of the times, I know when I'm talking about a reasonable doubt, or I'm listening to a judge or a magistrate discuss a reasonable doubt, one of the things that they will sometimes use as a reference point to the jury is that in a civil matter, the threshold is much lower, and that is on the balance of probabilities. So they don't really explain what that means either. They will say that in a civil matter, you'll only have to prove something on the balance of probabilities, whereas in a criminal matter, it has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. And the point that can be taken from that is, whatever the distance between the two is, there is a distance. So,
yeah, big one.
Yeah.
It might even be worth, just while we're talking about this particular Karrakatta rape situation, and it's something we've touched on in a previous podcast, but it's quite relevant today. We're still getting quite a lot of listener questions about why he pleaded guilty to this just before the trial started. Can we go back to that for a minute, Damien, and have a chat again about why that could have been the case?
Of course, and what I'll just do right on that moment is just have 2 seconds of silence for all the listeners around the world and around the state and around the country to answer it in their own mind. And I'm not being facetious, I'm simply saying why there can be only one reason. It's not about strategy. Legally, there can only be one reason why someone pleads guilty. And I appreciate that people are considering the concept of whether it was part of a strategy, but even if it is part of a strategy, once you stand up to the line and you say, I'm guilty of this, you're accepting responsibility for what's been alleged. You're accepting responsibility in the full concept of the context of the charge. So my answer to the question is, it has to be the reason why someone pleads guilty to something is because they did what is alleged, and they accept that they did what is alleged. I don't think it can be any more complex than that.
And certainly Justice Hall won't read any more into that than exactly what Damien said. You put your hand up, you admit it, and you say, yes, that I am that person. And I understand why the question keeps coming up, certainly on podcasts, and certainly speaking to people around the place as well. A lot of people have said, why would he have done that? I mean, I'm not a mind reader, it's sort of a bit spurious to speculate, really, because where does the speculation get to? Well, it doesn't give Mr. Edwards the credit that he probably should get for admitting that, which will probably annoy some people hearing that he should get any credit. But in law, a guilty plea does get you some credit no matter how late it comes. And so it is what it is. I mean, I'm sure that speculation will continue long through the trial and probably long after as well. But the simple answer is we'll never know, apart from that he put his hand up and said, yes, it was me.
Well, one thing we do know for certain is that he has the ability to plead guilty.
Yeah.
We can't, there's no way around that. We know that this man can accept responsibility.
Tim, also taking the stand today was another member of the forensic team who I think was mentioned in the podcast last week, Barry Mott. What was his role and in relationship to which scenes?
Yes, so he was another senior forensic officer that worked under Rob Amlar, who we heard a lot about last week. He had various roles at the Jane Rimmer crime scene. He took the role of photographer and photographed the scene in very tight space, as we've heard before. Jane's body was in a little alcove copse of thick bush just off Wellard Road, and he was the person that was tasked with taking the photographs there. And then 8 months later, when Kira's body was discovered, he was part of the team that again was tasked to go there. And on that occasion, he mostly collected insect evidence and potential exhibits from Kira's body, and did that in close association with Rob Hamlar, the forensic pathologist, Dr. Margolius, and the rest of his team. So, yeah, he was integral to that, which was why today he was integral to the evidence and will be tomorrow, because we didn't get to his cross-examination, which will be interesting, I think, given that he was taking exhibits. And probably most crucial, I didn't mention earlier, he was the person who took the lock of Kira's hair. That became exhibit RH17, which we already know the prosecution alleged contained several of these blue fibres. And we know from last week that taking of that exhibit wasn't captured on the video that was taken at Kira's crime scene as well. So I would expect and anticipate some series of questions about that hair sample that was taken tomorrow, given that it will become quite integral to the fibre part of the evidence that the prosecution put up.
Given that particular collection of the sample wasn't in the video footage, did he recall it being taken at the time?
He did remember taking it. He had to have his memory jogged, as many witnesses have and will have, because of the tyranny of time that we've talked about 23 odd years ago. But it was there. The timing was there on the exhibit log when it was taken, which matched up with the little portion of the video that wasn't shown. We basically skipped over those 3 minutes, which is obviously unfortunate for all concerned, because in an ideal world, you'd want all that video to just run and be able to see everything clearly. But he did remember taking it when his memory was jogged, but he wasn't really questioned on it over and over today, but I think he will be questioned about it over and over tomorrow.
Yeah. Was he questioned about any possible cross-contaminations or anything like that yet?
Not in so many words, but he was asked whether there was any possibility he could have touched Jane's body, for instance, and he did say in his evidence in chief that there was a possibility that he might have brushed her body when he was taking photographs, given the confined space that they were all trying to work in, but didn't say in particular that he remembered that he had, but he certainly admitted that he could have or may have. And in terms of Jane, in terms of Kira, my apologies, he was basically asked again about the process, about how he would have stored certainly the insect activity. Some of that was stored in alcohol in these jars to preserve it. So it was the question was process driven, but it didn't take him to any specific issues. That's obviously for the defence, and that will come tomorrow.
And given how rigorous the cross-examination was of all this information last week, we can expect that he will be, quite heavily questioned tomorrow.
Well, you can always get a sense that in court. We were getting towards the end of the day when Mr. Mott was finished, about 4 o'clock when his evidence-in-chief finished. We'd been finishing around 4:15, maybe 4:30 on a late sitting day. The Justice Hall said, I take it you don't want to start your cross-examination now, Mr. Yovich. And Mr. Yovich said quite a quick no, which would indicate, obviously, that the question is going to be a lot longer than 15 or 30 minutes. So, yes, he'll be back on the stand tomorrow, and I would imagine he might be there for a while.
Yeah. Well, just before we leave, we do have a question for you, Damien, from Josh Halliday, who has asked, it was mentioned in the Death Lilies episode that the defence would have to provide the prosecution with the report they intend to use to refute fibre evidence. I thought the defence wasn't required to provide anything to the prosecution at all.
Good question, Josh, especially given the circumstances. The short of it is, it remains the position that the defence isn't required to prove anything ever, but they do have a duty to disclose any expert material that they propose to rely on. And the reason that is so that the prosecution has time to have their experts consider the defence experts' opinion. So it's sort of almost a courtesy to the two experts for them to be able to consider what they're going to say in response to each other. So thanks for the question, Josh. It's a good one.
Well, thank you both for your time and expertise today. And for anyone who may be affected by the contents in tonight's podcast, trained operators at Lifeline are on 13 11 14, or you can contact the Sexual Assault Resource Centre on 1800 199 888. Thank you for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow with Ali Fan and Tim Clark. You'll be with us tomorrow as well for day 24 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.